Hello everybody. Testing audio 1 2 1 2. Hopefully you can all hear me. Let me know if you can, because this is a bit of a new setup. I'm just going to watch chat until people say something. Excellent, people can hear me. So, yes, this is roughly where the new area for streaming is going to be. So previously you got streams from basically where I did all my recording for videos anyway. That's not really possible anymore because we've reconfigured that room, and well, let's just say the view is not particularly au fait compared to what you had before. So I've moved the live stream element of things up into the library, which some of you may have seen from the library video, well, the book in French book review video I did last week, I think. Now, yeah, more models. There are more models on the other shelves. The thing is, I don't want to put too many more models on the shelves because otherwise then that hinders access to the books behind them, which is a little bit silly. Now, yeah, one of the mods will be stockpiling super chat questions. As per normal, we will be going through the Patreon alternate history questions first, then the super chats, then questions from chat. It is a little bit late, and the reason it's a little bit late is because I've spent pretty much the entire day doing medieval reenactment training, so that was fun. And as time goes on, what I'll probably do is each time we do a stream, I'm going to move around the library, find different little corners, and then once I've gone through 3 or 4 different potential setups in this room, people can say, you know, which one they prefer me to stream from generally. So yeah, that's the background. So let's get on with the Patreon questions. And for those of you wondering how late this is going to run, we'll see where we go. I mean, yes, I'm a bit tired, but on the other hand, you know, after a day of reenactment training, you get a nice fresh shower. So at the moment, I feel fairly fresh, and I have a fresh bottle of Iron Brew as well. Versus Arch asking about the t-shirt. No, well, there's no audio coming in from your end, so I can't record you. I do find it funny, actually, looking at some of the earlier live streams, how long I spent on those live streams wearing my headset until eventually I realised nothing's coming through audio-wise, so why am I wearing this headset? Anyway. Where's World of Warships Duck? World of Warships Duck is around... Where is World of Warships Duck? World of Warships Duck's around here somewhere. Oh, it's over there, behind me. Yeah, so that's... yeah, the various stuff you saw in the background is scattered around here, but you'll see it as people go around anyway. Now... Obviously, I do apologise. This is, I think we are 2 Patreon Drydocks behind. So to the patrons who asked the alternate history questions, again, I apologise. But, you know, time, etc. and circumstances have delayed some of these. So I think in a couple of weeks' time we'll have to do, or maybe next weekend we'll have to do, I think it's 219's live stream for alternate history, and then 223, which is coming out tomorrow, will have its own live stream, and then hopefully we'll be caught up in any case. The other thing is that unlike previous streams where I'm doing it from a really big screen, I'm now doing this with my laptop propped up underneath the webcam, so I can just about read the text of the live chat, but if you see me kind of leaning forward and squinting slightly, that'll be why. Anyway, enough babble. On with the first question from the Patreons. Primark359 asks, the angled flight deck was invented by the Royal Navy to get very early jets onto carriers, but would it have provided a benefit if it had been implemented sooner, or were there other simultaneous launch recovery solutions, flying off decks, halving the flight deck, that were just as good as the latest system in the absence of deck edge elevators? Basically, would angled flight decks have not provided much benefit during the interwar period to World War II? So There are some benefits to an angled flight deck for the interwar period in World War II, but as I've mentioned in a few previous dry docks, not really quite so many, because one of the things is that the angled flight deck benefits the modern jet in a lot of ways, not the least of which is that they can do a go around. They can. This is why they land with the engines going at fairly full power, because it means they can throttle up quite quickly and get away. That kind of thing you could kind of do with a piston engine aircraft, but it's a lot more difficult. So the go around feature is less useful. Also, you could, in theory at least, be conducting flight ops and in terms of takeoffs and landings on a interwar or World War II carrier, because the takeoff and landing distances required by aircraft were not as great. And that's why, if you've seen the F4F Wildcat video, if you see that I did with Rex's hangar, if you see some of the film footage that's included in that from the US National Archives, when you see aircraft coming in when they've got the crash barriers up, you'll sometimes see aircraft parked on the deck beyond that crash barrier, and that's because basically the deck is sectioned into two. So they're doing the landing and aircraft recovery ups on one side, and in those particular shots they've just got aircraft parked up front, but there's actually technically nothing stopping them launching aircraft off the front at the same time if they wanted to. The main advantage that the angled flight deck would have given interwar and World War II carriers would have been it would have slightly speeded up takeoff operations, in that, and you'd have to have a fairly substantial angled flight deck, so more akin to Nimitz, Forrestal, etc. carriers, as opposed to the relatively minimal angling that was given to some of the conversions and early angled deck carriers in the 50s. Because at that point, given again the short takeoff run that you needed for World War II and interwar aircraft, you could have a separate stream of aircraft taking off just to the port side of the ship. And of course, with a slightly larger surface area of the flight deck, especially if you're doing deck parking, you could carry slightly more aircraft. So there would be some minimal advantages, but the majority of the advantages that come with the angled flight deck later on, when the era of jets, don't really apply. And obviously it's a much more complicated thing to build an angled flight deck carrier as opposed to a straight deck carrier. People pointing out you can do go arounds with piston powered aircraft. This is true. However, the when you look at the way they did flight ops at the time, I suppose it depends how you do go arounds. There's plenty of footage of aircraft coming in, thinking about landing, and then deciding better of it and going around to try again. But once an aircraft has committed, a piston engine aircraft has committed to landing, even if they've got the front of the flight deck clear, you very rarely see aircraft that miss the traps or whatever actually pull round to go off and try again. Now partly that's sometimes they have the crash barriers up and they hit those, but you've also got to account for the fact that piston engine aircraft on carriers for the most part are tail draggers, so their attitude when they're coming in is slightly different as compared to most jets, which are mostly tricycle landing gear, which does make things slightly harder. Of course, as people are mentioning in the chat, piston engines can throttle up considerably faster than the early jets could, but the sort of principle of the go around the way modern jets do it, as far as I've read and as far as the most of the visual evidence from period carriers seems to go, it doesn't seem to have been a kind of a standard practice. You either didn't land, or if you tried to land, you usually were going and staying down somewhere, whether that was in a crash net over the side of the ship, upside down on the deck, or properly landed. Ham-fisted captain of a massive combination of numbers and letters asks, I've recently got into No Man's Sky, wherein the player can command one capital ship and a supporting fleet of up to 30 frigates. In the classic Age of Sail, was a similar force ever assembled, and what would its capabilities or mission be? Not really. About the closest you would probably find to a fleet like that would be possibly some of the convoy escorts, where you might find a third-rate ship of the line and a squadron of frigates. That's probably about it, but it wouldn't be a kind of 30 strong. It might be 4 or 5 frigates and a ship of the line. That's pretty much the only circumstance you'd find that kind of ratio. Frigates either tended to operate alone or in small groups on their own, but when they came into contact with capital ships, for the most part, if it wasn't a capital ship and a frigate meeting out in the open ocean, in terms of organised formations, frigates were usually acting as scouts, messenger relays, and outrunners for fleets, at which point the fleet of capital ships would normally massively outnumber the number of the frigates present. So, look at the Battle of Trafalgar. You got 27 British ships, you've got 33 Anglo-French ships, but on each side there's about half a dozen frigates. So, in the Age of Sail, you're not virtually never going to see 30 frigates assembled in one place, because that's just not their role. The closest you'd get to that would be maybe a couple of squadrons of frigates, but if you saw 12 frigates in one place that wasn't a port, you'd be wondering what on earth was going on, because that would be an extremely strange occurrence. So for those of you asking questions in the chat, bear in mind I have to get through the Patreon ones first, so your questions now will probably get horrifically buried, but do feel free to repost them when I get round to that section, obviously. Gabriel A. Hawkins asks, I understand the surface of Venus better than I understand engineering, so please be kind if my question is misplaced, okay? But Dodge Automotive touts the power of its hemi or hemispherical engine. My understanding of the hemi concept is that the hemispherical shape of the piston head produces more power compared to the flat piston head of the same size. Would the same concept hold true if the breech and or shell of a naval projectile were hemispherical, and give rise to a meaningfully more powerful naval rifle? And did any navy try this? Well, technically yes, in that a cannonball is going to present a hemispherical shape to the charge exploding and pushing it down the barrel. But in terms of whether or not it would give a meaningfully more power to a naval rifle, I think this is one of those cases of mathematics versus practicality, in that mathematically it may be possible, but practically speaking, you'd have to account for the fact you now have a hemispherical shell facing backwards, which poses all sorts of interesting issues about especially later on, about where you put a fuse, what you make it out of, how strong it's going to have to be, etc. But particularly more to the point is that if you're using standard bagged charges, which you would be for a battleship gun at least, you're then going to have to deal with this slightly indeterminate void space, which would be in the in a concave shape. And I suspect that's probably not going to do particularly good things to the stability of the shell, especially obviously because it's got to make its way down the rifling of the barrel. Of course, you could have a literal shaped charge behind the shell in order to cup the shell on its way, but this would also be incredibly complicated, and well, not just on the grounds you've had to manufacture now an additional complicated face for the shell, plus you'd have to have a very, very carefully and slightly oddly shaped charge, but you'd also now have to make sure that that charge in particular goes up front, and all the other charges would be flat. And that, that again adds additional difficulties, because when you're trying to fire as quickly as possible and moving charges from magazines to shell hoists and so forth, then you want to be able to just grab generic charge, stick on hoist, go, rather than well, we've got 6 charges and they've come out of these canisters, but one of them, we've got 6 normal charges. Where's the concave charge? Well, I don't know. Well, you were supposed to bring it. Well, maybe they're up on that upper rack. Oh, I have to get that. It's going to be an additional problem. So yeah, I I don't think anyone really tried it once you got into the era of truly powerful naval guns. Um, yes, and for the people asking, yes, I was on Todd's channel. I was there for Arrows versus Armour 2. That's something we can discuss in a bit once we get through this lot. Melendrus asks, would US Navy fleet admirals in the Pacific theatre have been aware of Yamato and Musashi's true specifications during the war, or would they have spent the whole war thinking the ships were 45,000 tonners with 16-inch guns? For the most part, the intel that they were being passed said that the Yamato and Musashi were probably around 45,000 tons with 16-inch guns. There were some intelligence reports that were available during the war that suggested the ships were considerably larger in terms of their displacement, and there were reports, usually the same reports, that suggested the ships had much larger guns. There was a report that actually, near enough as makes no difference, got the Yamato's specification spot on, but those reports were very much in the minority, and a lot of them came a bit later in the war. So I think, broadly speaking, most US Navy admirals will have been thinking the Yamatos were roughly on a par with the Iowas in terms of their specifications. They would not have been expecting to confront 18-inch guns brought for them in most of those places. Alternate historian Turtleduck asks, how were the tonnage limits for the Washington Naval Treaty decided on, and what would happen if there was only a number of ships limit and the gun size remains at 16-inch for battleships and 8-inch for cruisers? So the tonnage limits for the Washington Treaty were largely decided on, apart from for the carriers, were largely decided on the basis of what were people building at the time, and adding just a little bit of headroom for that. So the reason, for example, that cruiser armament was capped at 8 inches was basically because the Hawkins class were under construction with 7.5-inch guns, and the Japanese had started construction of some 8-inch cruisers. So in order to prevent them from having to scrap those, they just went, okay, well, we're going to cap it at 8 inches. Similarly, with the displacement for cruisers and for battleships, they were looking at what is currently being built, what is their tonnage, and what's their main armament. Okay, we're going to cap at the armament size, 16 inches, and we're going to go for the nearest, the next up nice round figure, 35,000 tons, for the capital ships, because it meant that the Colorados, Nagatos, and then it could all be completed, and the British could then argue for getting the Nelsons. And it's pretty much the same story across the board, as I said, except for carriers, because nobody had any really big carriers at that point, and so that's why you have these exceptions carved out for the big conversions, Akagi, Kaga, Lexington, and Saratoga, even if those were somewhat abused. And then the upper limit for carrier tonnage per ship was just, a matter of negotiation. It went back and forth a lot because people were trying to work out what is a reasonable displacement for a purpose-built carrier to be built up to, because as I said, no one had done that apart from Hermes and Hosho, which were under construction at the time, and they were considerably smaller than what anybody considered reasonable for a large carrier once they realized the big conversions were going to have to be done. If there was only a limit to a number of ships and the gun size limits remain, then, well, if there's basically no displacement limit, then things like the G3s, the Torsas, the Akagis, well, basically everything bar the N3s could be built, and the N3s would probably just have to have their 18-inch swap for 16-inch. Well, they could be built, I suppose. I think that would lead to a lot of problems, because if they said, right, well, you've got a fixed number of ships, but the gun size is there, but there's no displacement limitations either per ship or generally, that's going to encourage people to go for really, 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 really big ships, which means you're probably going to see 12, maybe even 15 gun, 16-inch armed battleships. A lot of it's going to depend on how much people are allowed to build, because with that kind of open cap, there'll be a lot of navies who ideally would basically want to drop. Well, why bother having a 25,000 ton 12-inch armed ship when something that weighs twice as much or more, mounting twice as many guns or more in a caliber that's 2, 3, 4 inches greater, is going to show up. So yeah, it would you would get much larger ships, but it would, exactly how many would depend on what the scrappage limitations, etc. were. Class A Cornate asks, this is a long one and the context will make it longer. So let's just say the British didn't do too well in World War One. I find out. In a hypothetical battle in the Coral Sea, the Australians have Superb, Temeraire, Hercules, Thunderer, Iron Duke, Emperor of India, Royal Oak, and Resistance. They haven't been able to do any modernizations due to budgeting, but the crews are well trained, led to the same quality as the Japanese. The Japanese have Satsuma, Aki, Setsu, Fuso, Yamashiro, Issei, and Hyuga. The Japanese all have early 1930s optical rangefinders. Assuming the planes and screens are awash, war games in our mega campaign give this battle an absolute coin flip after 8 games. So, your opinion is the tiebreaker. Who wins? Now, this is a really interesting one, because at the lower end of things, when you've got Satsuma, Aki, and Setsu, Superb, Temeraire, and Hercules are, and Thunderer, I guess, as well. A, there's slightly more of them, and B, I would say they're probably slightly superior designs. But then you get to the top end, you've got the Fusos and Issei, so you've got 4. And against them, you've got Iron Duke, Emperor of India, Royal Oak, and Resistance. Now, obviously, Resistance was never historically completed, but Royal Oak and Resistance, I would say, are somewhat superior to Issei and Hyuga, whereas Fuso and Yamashiro are probably slightly superior to Iron Duke and Emperor of India, which makes things, again, fairly balanced, save for the fact, as you mentioned, that if the Japanese have the early 1930s optical rangefinders and the British are still with their late World War One fit, the Japanese have a definitive advantage in fire control at that point. The big elephant in the room is that the British fleet can do 21 knots and change. The Japanese fleet can't, unless it abandons some of its older ships. So if the Japanese can get their hits in early at longer ranges, then they will win. If the British can get their ships to close the range to the point where they can mitigate the effect of the better optical rangefinders on the Japanese ships, then obviously the British have a numbers advantage, and generally when you're doing the 1v1s down the line, generally, other than that, slightly superior vessels. So yeah, it is an absolute coin toss. I think probably would basically come down to the weather. If you're in your scenarios, the weather is nice and clear and the skies are open, the Japanese have a decent chance of pulling off a win. If the weather is in any way, shape, or form not conducive to long-range gunnery, whether that be clouds, fog, nighttime, or just the gun smoke of everybody because there's not a lot of wind, then between numbers and being able to close the range, the British might just about take it. Because really, the rangefinders get a little bit better, but it's the fire control systems that really make the difference. F-19A Ghost Rider, if we assume for the sake of argument that the Royal Navy achieved a triumphant decisive victory at Jutland, what happens next? Did the British have any plans or intentions recorded as to what would follow the total defeat or destruction of the Kaiser's fleet? Was an assault on the North Sea coast of Germany on the cards? It depends who you ask. Certain people really did want to do a assault on the North Sea coast of Germany. The flip side to that is that even the destruction of the High Seas Fleet doesn't change the fact there's an awful lot of torpedo boats, destroyers, submarines and mines off of the North German coast, which is not a scenario you will really want to take a battle fleet into. But with that said, if for whatever reason the High Seas Fleet is basically a non-entity as far as combat goes, it releases a lot of British ships from having to sit at Scapa Flow. The single most important thing, actually, to be honest, would probably be, with a good chunk of the Grand Fleet's destroyers free, those destroyers are now available for convoy escort, which probably means that the convoys start a lot sooner, because one of the main reasons why the convoys didn't start when perhaps on paper they should is there just weren't the destroyers available to escort them. Now there are. The cruisers, well, the Harwich Force will get boosted, so the Harwich Force and the Dover Patrol will have significant numerical advantages over their German opposite numbers, so that will help lock that down. The battle fleet, on the other hand, if they've got nothing else to do, then, well, there's three possible scenarios for the battle fleet. One is a bunch of them get sent down with escorts to the Adriatic to try and have a go at the Austro-Hungarian fleet. Possible, but unlikely. Another possibility, depending... I mean, someone might try and rescue, salvage, restart the Gallipoli campaign with a lot more offshore fire support available. Or the alternative might well be attacks on not necessarily the German coastline, possibly the German coastline. I mean, you might get sort of the inverse of things like the Scarborough raid going on. But I suspect there probably would be pressure put on Germany. Maybe they might go back after Heligoland or something like that. But yeah, the problem is with the battle fleet, there's 3 or 4 different things they might be doing, but it's very difficult to work out which one they'd pick. Or they might just, swing at anchor going, hooray, we won. And everybody cheers. I should probably put my phone onto silent. I apologise. There we go. Hopefully we will not be disturbed. David S. Speaks says, hello. I say hello back. In the introduction of the 5-minute guides on the third battleship salvo, it looks like several dustbins were left on the deck and they explode in debris from concussion of the salvo. Do you know or have any opinion as to what this was and what caused it? So, as I said, I think during the competition to identify the various ships in the intro sequence, as far as I'm aware, it's mostly just a collection of loose articles that somebody left out by accident. And then the blast, the shockwave, and the subsequent vacuum just went, yep, we're taking these with us. Some people have suggested it might have been a deliberate test, but I haven't seen any particularly convincing evidence towards that effect yet. It could be. Maybe, some kind of test to work out where the blast radius is, but genuinely I think someone just left something out that they shouldn't have. The Hand of Ray asks, what is your favourite paper or just plain made up ship from World of Warships? Okay, well, if we're including paper ships, as in ships that were properly designed but never built, probably the Minotaur, mostly because I just like playing with it. It's if you handle it like a slightly clumsy, overgrown destroyer, you can't really go wrong with a good old Minotaur, even if turn broadside unintentionally or intentionally to your opponent, and you will probably pop. Shazix asks, what if in the Washington Naval Treaty the British are allowed to build 5 G3s, the US 5 Lexingtons, and the Japanese 3 Amagis? All other points of the Washington Naval Treaty are historical. Now that's an interesting one. Because if the US has allowed 5 Lexingtons as battlecruisers, they only actually have 1 hull available for carrier conversion. The Japanese, well, they were planning on building more than 3 Amagis, but between them and the Tosas, they have more hulls. They actually have more hulls available that are suitable for carrier conversion. The South Dakota's hull really not so brilliant a proposal for carrier conversions. Although, to be perfectly fair, the British probably come out the winner of this, because the G3 is, of the Washington Cherry Tree battlecruiser designs, is probably the best of the 3. But that being said, if the US is allowed to build 5 Lexingtons, I suspect they will probably be doing some rather radical redesigns and upgrades of them when they get to construct them. But yeah, going into the Second World War, that's going to be an interesting one, because if the big 3 powers have these big, otherwise treaty-breaking capital ships, it makes everybody else's job a lot more difficult, because there's only a certain amount of cheating on the treaty you can do. Admittedly, things like Littorio and Bismarck were well in excess of treaty displacement, but even so, even with all okay, Roma wasn't operational for most of the Italian involvement in the war, so with 2 Littorios and 2 Bismarcks in play, well, if the British have 5 G3s, they can overmatch them just with that, let alone if the US has some kind of uprated Lexington running around, albeit the US will probably be using those against the Japanese Amagis, or guarding against the Japanese Amagis at any rate. So, yeah, it's most of its effects are going to be World War II, plus, of course, we don't get quite as many large carriers. We're about a third of the way through, just over a third of the way through the Patreon questions, so we're doing quite well. Stephen Rizika asks, what if the Washington Naval Treaty, there was a clause that the signing powers could build new capital ships to replace old ones, however these new ships wouldn't be allowed to reach the limit of the treaty, but instead not exceed the original tonnage, not including any additions, of the ship it's replacing. For example, if the Japanese wanted to replace the Fuso class, their new battleship cannot go over a standard displacement of 29,000 tons. What kind of navies can you see coming out of this what kind of designs can you see coming out of this for various reasons? Okay, so let's think this one through. See, weirdly, again, the people who win the most out of this are probably going to be the British, because they have a huge chunk of their fleet made up of relatively recent designs. The QEs and the Revenges, which means they have more displacement per ship to build to replace. The Japanese, if they're left, I mean, okay, the Japanese are probably doing okay because they've got the Fusos, Iseis, and Kongos basically, with Nagato and Mutsu on their way, but they're also all very new, so they're probably not going to want to replace them anytime soon. The US has got a little bit of the short end of the stick because the US is the only power at that point that's left with 12-inch ships, which is a little bit inconvenient. The British have some 13.5-inch ships to replace as well. See, the annoying thing at that point is because you've got various ship classes going up in increments of displacement, probably what you'd see is people. I think you'd see a lot of 6-gun designs, to be honest, because if you're placing Battleship like for like, on the various displacements, you're probably going to go, right, well, more modern propulsion machinery, we can get up to the same speed with less power. That saves weight. We need bigger guns, though, and the armour has to be upgraded to reflect that. You know, if a ship's designed with and to defend against 12 or 13.5-inch projectiles, but now the upper limit is 16-inch, well, now you want armour that's going to defend against a 16-inch projectile. That's going to eat up all the weight you've saved from the better machinery, and then some. Plus, you know, if you want 16-inch guns and the ship you're replacing had 12 or 13.5 or 14-inch guns, unless it's the Tennessee or the California, you're going to need to do some serious work to try and, you know, bring it up to spec. So, I mean, the Americans probably have the best of it for replacements at that point because they've got the Colorados, and if they want to replace the Tennessees or maybe the New Mexicos, they can probably engineer basically roughly the same ship but with twin 16s and use the saving in machinery weight to up the armour. Whereas if you're looking at replacing Arkansas or the 13.5-inch ships for the British, etc., you're not going to get 12 or 10 guns on that kind of small displacement. If you want to have, I think if you want to have armour that's going to protect you against your guns, you're going to have to accept a 6-gun design, you know, 2 twins up front and 1 aft, or maybe a kind of a Deutschland style 2 triples. Unless or instead you drop the armor down a bit and make a bunch of 6-gun battle cruisers, i.e. various flavors of mini renown, except with 16-inch, because at that point, I mean, at that point you can kind of play with armor thickness in exchange for speed, but it would be a mess because, as I say, everyone will be trying to fit 16-inch guns and armor against the same and a certain minimum speed, but on so many different displacement hulls. Trek 001, just quickly picking up, are the Patreon questions submitted here or on Patreon channel? These alternate history, these basically they're on Patreon, and every month patrons from the 2nd tier and upwards get 1 guaranteed question a month, and that's either going to be alternate history, which is the ones that get answered on the live stream, or regular history, in which case those get answered in the recorded version. And yeah, that's where those questions come from. So that's why I'm going through this question list first and then coming to the chat. Some random non asks, if the US or any other navy developed dreadnoughts first, what would have changed? It depends how quickly. I mean, the name possibly might have changed because dreadnoughts were called Dreadnought after Dreadnought because Dreadnought was first, and the name sounds really cool. I don't particularly think Satsuma would have really caught on as a generic overall title. I mean, it probably would have caught on for a little while, but not for a tremendous amount of time. But as I say, the other question would be, how soon, how soon, how much earlier than Dreadnought? Because historically, the British had a bit of a building gap for battleships soon after Dreadnought. If they're the ones left on the back foot, they may not do that. They may, they're going to be playing catch up. But if, for example, I don't know, the South Carolinas are laid down a year earlier, it probably doesn't change an awful lot other than who gets to be first. If and it's the Americans and the Japanese, ironically enough, who are making the running on getting the dreadnoughts in the water first. The Germans, the French, the Russians, etc. They're all slightly late to the dreadnought race compared to those three. So yeah, I don't think it would change an awful lot materially in the run up to World War One, because all three nations were pretty much developing Dreadnought at the same time. It's just Jackie Fisher kind of leveraged the capabilities of the Royal Dockyards to get Dreadnought in there first. Oh yes, okay. Trek 001 just clarifying his question. So yeah, basically the recorded parts, the sort of what I term the mainline history questions, they're up to date. And if you've just joined and you asked your question before yesterday, maybe the day before, then it'll be, and it's a sort of a normal history question, it'll be in this month's recording, which will be up tomorrow, or I guess on Patreon today. But if it's an alternate history question, I think we're two live streams behind. Sean Riley saying Satsuma was a samurai clan in Japan. Yes, it was. And yes, the same in the UK. It is a fruit nowadays. Randy Topeka asks, in the Battle of the Absolutely Ridiculous, how would a Tillman battleship have fared in combat against a German H-class battleship if they met in 1v1 combat? Entirely dependent on which Tillman and which H-class, because you have some truly ridiculous Tillmans, the ones that are carrying almost every 16-inch gun ever produced, and in some cases almost every 18-inch gun ever produced, and you also have some truly ridiculous German H-classes. I think if you took the most ridiculous Tillmans, like Tillman 4-2 or something, up against the most ridiculous H, the advantage that the Germans would have is that the H-class is considerably faster, but in a straight-up gunfight, assuming fire control, etc., is all the same, the Tillmans, the biggest Tillmans, I think, would probably win, because they just have so many guns, assuming that, a sextuple 16-inch turret doesn't have 1,000,000,001 mechanical issues. You can just deluge the other side in 16-inch shells. One decent salvo on target, and it's basically most of the combat capability of the other side gone. Whereas if you go further down the chain into something more reasonable, like, I don't know, H42, 142-ish, and the sort of the mid-range Tillmans, that's when you see, I think, the more sensible Tillmans and the upper end of the sensible H-classes. I think the H-classes have the upper hand in those cases. SMS Schliessen asks, I know it's outside the time frame, but do you think that King Charles III will do a fleet review similar to the one done in 1937 next year? Very unlikely, basically, next year. Will there be a fleet review during the reign of King Charles III? Probably. Is it going to be anytime soon? I don't think so. Political and economic factors mitigate against. Eric J. Van Dooting asks, if you were put in charge of designing the Bismarck class and charged with optimizing the class for commerce raiding, with the difficulties of breaking out into the Atlantic in mind, what would your design look like? You're given complete freedom to design as you see fit, but you can't cancel the class to replace them with entirely different types of ships, such as more U-boats, etc. What would I do to optimize it for commerce raiding? Okay, so if I'm forced to make a pure commerce raiding battleship, well, my standard answer to almost any redesign of the Bismarck is I'm grabbing a 127 or 128 millimeter and I'm fast tracking development of it as a dual purpose mount, because as I've said before, the Bismarck class has a lot of spare acreage in its amidships deck space, and when you count, like, you count the number of 150 and 105 millimeter barrels, there's a lot of guns there. If you rationalize that in a single overall dual purpose layout, then you can get a lot of dual purpose guns on that, and that will hopefully give you considerably better air defense. I think the other thing at that point is air attack is going to be a major threat to a commerce raiding battleship, because it's moving around a lot and people are going to be using carriers to try and find it and slow it down. So obviously you want to keep the speed. So I think you, again, given the considerable beam of the ship compared to some, I might even invest in something like when you see Yamato in her late stage configuration with that kind of multi-tiered pyramid of AA guns. I might actually even ask the designers to do something like that. So you'd have a lower level of 128 dual purpose, or 127, whatever, then a middle level of similar dual purpose, and then on top of that would be a mixture on a third tier, mouse down, mixture of 37 millimeter and 20 millimeter quad AA guns, and the good ones, the good 37 millimeters, not the single shotters. Now, how am I going to pay for that? Well, make the armor layout more efficient, adopt an all or nothing scheme. That'll save some weight on the armor layout, and then you need more fuel. If you're going to do commerce raiding, you need a lot of fuel. So, I mean, find more space for fuel tanks if you can. If absolutely necessary, I might even be tempted to drop Caesar turret in exchange for even more fuel. That's a bit of a dicey one, though, because I mean, a Bismarck with 6 modern 15-inch guns is still a colossal threat to pretty much all the old battleships that are being used on the convoy escort duties. And whether you've got 6 or 8 guns is probably not going to make too much difference if you get cornered by, King George V and Rodney. But it probably would make a difference if you were cornered by one or the other, or Prince of Wales. So, although for commerce raiding and the fact you're theoretically disengaging rather than engaging fast battleships, it kind of makes sense to drop a turret in exchange for even more fuel, so you can just hightail it out of there. I think I'd probably want a complete design study to see if that's properly feasible. The problem is if in this case the point of a commerce raiding battleship is you want to be able to scare off the old battleships which the British were using to deter the Scharnhorst, so you kind of have to have the 15-inch. You can't really cut that down. Although if I could persuade Krupp to go with, a sensible interrupted screw breech block, I might actually be able to get maybe a 3 triple layout rather than a slightly inefficient 4 twin, which would again save weight and actually give me an extra gun. Hi Bacon Bomb asks, using ships from the beginning of World War II, i.e. 1940, across all nations, using one class of ship from each type, carriers, battleships, battlecruisers, etc., etc., what would the Drakenfell Navy consist of? Okay, if I'm going with 1940, with 1940 it depends if I'm allowed to use ships that are under construction or only ships that are in service. Because, you know, if we go with ships under construction, then I can grab things like North Carolinas, maybe South Dakota, etc. Whereas if I'm going with only ships that are actually fully constructed and in service, that limits the options quite a lot. So if we say we're going with ships that are actually commissioned and in service, then carrier-wise, I would go for Ark Royal, but with US flight doctrine, because Ark Royal actually has, between a hangar space and a decks, more square footage than a Yorktown and considerably better anti-aircraft armament. So pair that with US design, with US air group philosophy, and you get a truly scary aircraft carrier. Battleships, I mean, for 1940, fast battleship wise, if we're going with something that's actually in service, well, North Carolina and Washington come in 41. Richelieu is definitely not ready. Bismarck's not ready. Littorio, well, it'll be a toss-up basically between Littorio and King George V, I think. Battlecruisers, if I've got a lot of them, then Strasbourg, probably. I mean, this is the only modern battlecruiser. Well, Strasbourg's crossing the line into fast battleship, but I'll kind of blink and squint sideways and call it a battlecruiser just to get Strasbourg, because otherwise the only other option really is Hood. Heavy cruisers. Oh, Algerie is... yeah, Algerie's in service, so I'll take Algerie. Light cruisers, Brooklyns. Destroyers... oh... again, some of the really nice World War II destroyers aren't really quite in service yet. I think it'll be a toss-up between a Tribal and a Mogador. Subs... it depends what I'm using my subs for. Depends where I am. Because, you know, if I'm going to be out in a Pacific style environment, then you want something like a big US fleet boat. If you're in a Atlantic style environment, but your main targets are going to be enemy warships, then maybe actually a Japanese style sub would be quite useful, a Japanese like cruiser sub. If you're in the Mediterranean, in a Mediterranean shallow water confined environment, you don't want either of those because they'd be horrifically vulnerable because they're big, and you want a small attack sub. So the subs are quite difficult to pick. Lord Nelson asks, this time I wish things to be a bit more challenging for my alter ego. You are put in charge of the Danish defences at Copenhagen 2 months before the battle. The resources of Denmark are at your disposal, and as an avid naval scholar, you've studied the Battle of Aboukir very carefully. You can be certain that Nelson will attack nevertheless, but how will you respond? Ooh, that's a good one. See, the problem with doing Copenhagen better is that the Danes actually, for what they had, the Danes did pretty damn well. there's very little you can do to pick holes in what the Danish defences were, with the exception of maybe one or two morale issues in certain elements, but not even then. I mean, the only things excuse me, the only things that I can think of that I would do differently to the Danes would be maybe to see if I can throw together a fleet of small gunboats, which is what they actually historically used later, a few years later. And if I can station them on the landward, just sort of hiding on the landward side of the ships they've got, so once the engagement starts, obviously initially they're sheltered, and then once the engagement starts they can swarm around and add their firepower to things. And then maybe also set up mortar batteries and pre-sight them down the likely lines of attack to try and rain explosive shells down. I think those are really the only two big changes that I could make to the Danish defences that would represent a significant improvement, because in 2 months you're not going to whistle up, a brand new ship of the line or whatever. So Clayton Bradish asks, if Force Z is never destroyed and links with everything planned in the last revision to the Admiralty prior to Japan attacking, how would this affect thinking of the Japanese in how aggressive they should be? So Force Z survives its historical demise and continues to survive until it can link up and become part of ABDA command. See, the thing is, the Japanese do have capital ships available in the area. They will probably have more capital ships available made available in the area, because their battleships, for the most part, weren't really doing all that much at this time period. So sending like, say, Nagato and Mutsu to assist the Congos probably wouldn't be out of the question. Obviously, the Japanese carriers will make hunting the Repulse and Prince of Wales a considerable priority. But the other thing is that the Japanese land advances are probably unlikely to be stopped. They might be slowed down a fraction, but they're very unlikely to stop overall. And the further the Japanese advance, the newer air bases they can capture or set up, and the effective range of those torpedo-armed bombers, which will now be there in greater numbers and will have, more torpedoes available to them, will gradually get longer and longer. So Force Z will delay the Japanese advance, but if they want to remain alive, that means they're going to have to be constantly falling back in the face of Japanese land advances, opening up new airfields for those aircraft. Which means, it's really delaying the inevitable. Singapore is probably still going to fall, at which point you kind of have one of two options. Either they head for Australia, in which case you have the slightly bizarre scenario of Repulse and Prince of Wales being the fast battleship escort to the US carrier forces in the early part of the war, before North Carolina and Washington can show up. Who knows, maybe one or both of them will be available for the Guadalcanal campaign. Or possibly they fall back to Ceylon and then they start playing funny games with Nagumo during the Indian Ocean raid. And how well that goes, who knows. Michael Griffith asks, if Admiral Togo's teaching of Hirohito had been more political and naval-centred, could the army have been replaced as the guiding force of Japan's 20s and 30s? Failing that, was he ever going to be a strong enough leader to force the army and navy to set aside their hatred of each other? I don't think the way that the Imperial Japanese culture developed in the interwar period, I don't think anyone was going to be able to completely subvert their massive rivalry and hatred without, basically just decapitating the leadership and continuing to do so until you got to a segment of officers who at least could try to get on. Um, as far as could the Navy have replaced the army as the guiding forces of Japan in the 20s and 30s, I don't think so. Largely because the Washington Treaty meant that the Navy was capped. And the other problem, of course, being that if Japan wants to expand, if Japan wants to grab territory, you had your two visions. The army vision, mostly based on land, on mainland Asia, and the Navy vision, which was out at sea, various islands and everything. The fundamental problem being that the Navy vision involved conflict with one or the other of the big powers, Britain or America. The Army's vision involved fighting China and maybe the Soviets. And that was considered doable. Whereas in the 20s and 30s, the Japanese government was not particularly keen on needlessly antagonizing the US or the British. So, whilst Hirohito might have somewhat increased the Navy's cachet in things, I don't think there's a huge amount he could have done to shift things away that much from the way that Japan went. Frank Bodenschatz asks, have you considered anything on the state of the Russian Navy now? Personally, sure. But not on the Channel. As I said, the Channel goes up to 1950 unless either a ship was laid down in the 40s but served afterwards, in which case I'll cover the career of the ship, or if somebody who served in a Navy post 1950 is happy to give an interview and talk about their experiences. But this channel is a historical channel and, will remain that way. So yeah, you're not going to see analysis of the Russian-Ukrainian war happening on this channel, no matter what I may or may not think about what's going on there. Quite apart from anything else, outside of a few known facts, pretty much anything that's said at this stage will be in large part speculation. Because that's what happens when a war is currently ongoing. It's that kind of thing. If any of you were watching the Mark Rober video about dropping an egg from space recently, and they pointed out the people who could help him make a guided space-to-ground rocket to drop his egg in a specific location are all sworn to secrecy by their various governments, because that's basically a guided missile, an orbital to ground guided missile. It's kind of the same thing. Anyone who knows exactly what's happening at the moment isn't really going to be in a position to say anything. Texas and LaShock asks, why does King Neptune care so much about a ship's name, to the point that he lays curses on those who have their names changed? Who knows? As Bender from Futurama would say, and admittedly, okay, it's one step removed culturally, but merciful Poseidon is not merciful. I think when it comes to that, it's basically, I suppose it's an advanced form of Pascal's wager, in that the sea is so cruel and unforgiving that you hedge your bets by just not doing anything that in any way, shape or form could even remotely be considered to possibly change your balance of fortunes out at sea. And, you know, all it takes is one or two ships being renamed and then meeting sticky ends for everyone to go, right, that's a bad idea. You know, never mind the fact there might be many other ships that get renamed and do fine, but as soon as it becomes widely publicised that, well, this guy renamed his ship and sailed off into the ocean and vanished without trace, that's going to be a major deterrent to anyone else doing that. I mean, never mind the fact that that probably happened because the guy who now owns the ship was brand new to the ship and maybe didn't know quite how to handle it properly, and it was a second-hand ship anyway. But, you know, cause and effect. Rebel Skvirl asks, if you could build an ideal World War II submarine by taking the best aspects of each of the major combatant submarine designs and technologies, what would you choose to include and why? Oh, that's easy. Okay, so you take the torpedo computer from an American fleet sub, and pretty much the whole most. Shut up, Alexa. Computer, stop. Anyway, you take the American torpedo fire control system, most of the hull design of an American fleet sub, the torpedoes from a Japanese sub, the Type 91s, and the forward torpedo battery of a T-class. So, yeah, that would... Well, as long as you're not fighting in the Mediterranean... Oh, and back it up with some, if you're going to go a little bit late, we'll back it up with some acoustic homing torpedoes from the Germans. So at that point you have an extremely long range, relatively high speed fleet submarine with a 10 torpedo forward salvo of long range, long lance adapted Type 91s with pretty much the best fire control you can ask for. And if there's any pesky escorts, you've got some acoustic homers to get them to go away. Oh, well, yeah, people point out snorkels from the Dutch subs as yes. Well, I mean, that kind of goes without saying, really. But that's getting into the details. Three Papa asks, how accurate is the 1953 movie Malta story in depicting the frequency and veracity of aerial attacks on naval targets in the Mediterranean? If you've not seen the movie, then do you know of a movie or documentary that does a good job depicting the frequency and veracity of Axis aerial assaults in the Mediterranean? I vaguely recall having seen that movie years ago, but I certainly haven't seen it in the past 15-20 years. And to be honest, there's actually not that many movies about the Mediterranean campaign. There have been a few documentaries, but to be honest, the last time I saw a documentary about the war in the Mediterranean that went into any significant detail, as in a TV documentary, it was the World at War series, which is obviously quite old now. But they did a relatively good job of depicting just how frequently you could be attacked in the Mediterranean. And it was... The thing with the Mediterranean is that you either didn't get attacked at all if you weren't spotted, or if you did get attacked, generally it would... Assuming that the early ones weren't successful, you would generally actually then get this running war of attrition, because between the Luftwaffe and the Regia Aeronautica, they had enough aircraft and there were few enough Allied ships that once they kind of locked in where you were and where you were going, you could be attacked by anything from 3 to 30 plus aircraft in the morning, and then another formation might show up at lunchtime, and another formation in the late afternoon, and another formation the next day, and so on and so on and so on and so forth, until either you got out of range of the aircraft, or you managed to evade them overnight by going in a different direction, or you got sunk. Sam Signorelli asks, if the German and Japanese navies had not held back large capital ships like Tirpitz, Yamato and Musashi early in the war, and had Bismarck not been sunk, how might that have changed the war? I mean, on the German side, it's probably not going to change all that much, because Tirpitz was, depending on exactly how you read things, either not ready or in a similar state to Prince of Wales by the time that Bismarck sailed, and Bismarck was, relatively speaking, newly commissioned as well. So early on, the Germans weren't holding back their large capital ships. Early on, the Scharnhorsts were out there and being quite busy. And as I say, Bismarck sailed near enough as soon as she was fully ready. Tirpitz didn't sail because they didn't consider her fully ready. So, you know, if the only change with Bismarck not being sunk is, well, then you've got to do the Channel Dash with Bismarck at some point. I think the bigger of the two would be the Japanese, because, well, for the Japanese, early war is 1942, not 1939, 1940. And whilst Yamato and Musashi were around kind of, in the background of Midway and so on and so forth, as I've said before, if the Japanese had been prepared to shove Yamato and or Musashi down into Iron Bottom Sound during the Guadalcanal campaign, that might have changed a few things. Yeah, I mean, especially the two night battles of, again, really badly named, but the two big night actions of Guadalcanal, so Hiei Kirishima et al., and then Washington versus Kirishima. If in those cases Hiei and Kirishima, or later just Kirishima alone, had either been replaced or supplemented by Yamato or Musashi, that could have gone quite differently. I mean, heck, even the bombardment that the Congos managed to pull off against Henderson Field would go very, very differently if there were Yamato and Musashi adding their weight to that barrage. Patrick Donnelly asks, after the Battle of Midway, instead of being assigned to Nimitz's Chief of Staff, Rear Admiral Spruance is assigned to Guadalcanal. What position would he take, and how long do you think he would last? Well, he's going to be with the carrier fleet. Exactly what... I mean, it depends on seniority, where he ends up. He's probably going to be second in command of the carrier fleet for a bit, then probably eventually going to end up in charge of it. How long... I mean... How long do you think it lasts? How long's a piece of string? What, if any, effect does him being there have on Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz? Because if it's relatively negligible, then we basically get the campaign playing out as it does and the changes of command happening as it does. If he's able to orchestrate something different and pull off a greater success, then he will obviously last longer. But yeah, it's not, I don't think, given the way Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz turned out, I don't think it's something that he would be in a position to substantially change everything. Not especially when you only really have two big carrier battles. Both of which are a bit messy because both sides are still learning. Salty Viking 10,022 asks, what is Mrs. Drack's favourite ship of each type? I have no idea. Well, now being upstairs, it's much harder to ask Mrs. Drack if she was here, which she isn't. She is out and away at the moment. But I will keep that question in mind, and next time I do a live stream, hopefully Mrs. Drack will be somewhere in the vicinity and I can ask her. So please remind me next live stream that I need to ask Mrs. Drack what her favourite ships are. And then the last Patreon alternate history question, you'll be glad to know, is from Okage. I think that, I did check the pronunciation, I think that's how it is. I'm probably wrong. Okay, so this is a long one. Let me just read it and see if I can summarize it. Okay, so basically the question is, if the Japanese very carefully bypass all American territories on their way to go after British and Dutch East Indies territories, which in turn, for whatever reason, makes the Americans dispatch the Pacific Fleet to the Philippines to keep an eye on things, and then as they're on final approach into the Philippines, Kitakami and a squadron of heavy torpedo carrying destroyers managed to infiltrate the lines and dump torpedoes in the water. How much damage could a very lucky Kitakami and a squadron of torpedo heavy destroyers do? How would the battle play out from there until Kitakami escapes or what's left of the Americans make it to port? Okay, so if the Americans are going full bore with the Pacific Fleet for whatever reason, in this case, Kitakami and her companions are probably mostly not escaping. Because if they've got into position to get close-range torp launches on the American battle line, that means they now have to fight their way past not only any American battleships that are still operational, but the cruiser and destroyer screen, which means that they're going to be very, very heavily outnumbered. So they're probably, and they're not exactly the world's most tough vessels, so they're probably going to get shot down in, maybe half an hour, 45 minutes after everyone becomes aware of their existence. The flip side is, how much damage could they do if they get lucky? A huge amount, because, well, if we're hand waving our way into having a fully operational torpedo god of a Kitakami in place, if she's got into an American formation of battleships, just given the sheer numbers of torpedoes she can launch, and given she can launch one whole set of banks, swing around, launch the other lot, plus all the Japanese destroyers, if we're giving them a relatively lucky strike run, they can devastate the American battle line with that many torpedoes at close range. In fact, their largest problem will probably be stringing themselves out so that they can hit everything. Obviously, exactly how many hits they land per ship, how much damage that does, and whether the ships sink or they limp into port or whatever, that's all very much roll of the dice. But, a Kitakami and a squadron of Japanese destroyers with sort of 9+ torpedo launchers per ship, somehow getting into a closed up formation traveling at night, it is a recipe for complete and utter devastation, assuming that they're the ones who get the first drop. So yeah. Right, so that is the Patreon questions. And now I'm going to quickly go through the super chats, which Fleet of Oceans has kindly gathered. So first, Patrick Forney asks, what do you think about the book The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors? If you've read it, it is an excellent book and definitely worth picking up. I think US Navy Institute Press has the original book, which obviously is the detailed history part, and then you also have, there's, I believe, a kind of not comic but kind of that kind of thing. I guess you could probably call it comic version, as in it has pictures and everything and is told in cell shades. So that's also, why is that put there? I just spotted a book I need to move around. Nevertheless, you can get either one from, I think, from USNI Press. So yeah, very definitely worth a look. The second super chat came from Deep Blue Dreams. If the US Navy knew the accurate details of Yamato and the A-150 successors, do you believe Montana would have been rearmed with 8 18-inch guns in place of her 12 16s, and what else would be changed? Most likely no, because when the Montanas were being considered, they did look at twin 18-inch gun designs, but they decided that actually the 12 16-inch 50s offered a considerable number of advantages, and that the the at long range, the penetrative power of a 16-inch 50 with a super heavy shell was close enough to the potential penetration power of the 18-inch guns that they had available for testing, or the 18-inch gun that they had available for testing, that it would be better to throw out 12 shells per salvo rather than 8. So I think the Montanas would remain as 12 16-inch ships. But in terms of what else would be changed, they would probably look at some of the even more heavily protected variants that were being considered rather than the one that they actually went with. Because there are a whole ton of design studies. If it wasn't for the fact I'd trip over the microphone, I'd grab US battleships from over there. That's why I keep looking. Squirrel Jenkins asks, if the heroics of Barcelona and Edson somehow failed and the Japanese regained Henderson Field, how does this play out in the long term? It depends whether if the US is able to get it back, because the fall of Henderson Field and its ending up in Japanese hands has a twofold effect. The first is, of course, that the Americans are denied the cover of the Cactus Air Force. That makes it much safer for the Japanese Navy to play during the day, because the Cactus Air Force were able to operate basically near enough continuously. And they're obviously a separate strike unit. If they're out of the picture, then there's fewer strike aircraft available overall, and the ones that are available have to be operated from the carriers, which are going to therefore have a much slower response time because they've got to be launched from further away. Carriers can't really maintain the tempo of operations on an aircraft for aircraft basis compared to an airfield that has a similar number of aircraft available. So the number, not only is the overall number of aircraft reduced, but the operational tempo of the ones that are left is considerably reduced. And coupled with that, if the Japanese have captured Henderson Field in some way relatively intact, they can start basing their own aircraft out of it. So now the Japanese have near enough continuous air cover over Guadalcanal, and the Americans are the ones on the back foot. But of course, this all depends on, one, the Japanese not just taking Henderson Field, but taking a sufficient area around Henderson Field that aircraft that are coming into land aren't just going to be shot at with rifle fire and everything else. And it also depends on the Japanese holding it. I suspect if the Japanese in real life had actually managed to regain Henderson Field, that would have been priority number one the minute the American forces had regrouped, to either retake it, or if they can't retake it, to at least make life incredibly difficult for the Japanese. Colin Cameron asks, after hearing about water and concrete for armour used by the Royal Navy and the Regia Marina, I wonder how effective a non-Newtonian fluid would be. I mean, it would probably be relatively useful in some circumstances. The two big problems you're going to have is, one, how much of your non-Newtonian fluid do you need to be the equivalent of an inch of steel? This is kind of the thing I keep coming back to with the Regia Marina's concrete. It's like, how dense was that foamed concrete? Because if your equivalent volume of non-Newtonian fluid ends up actually, in terms of effectiveness compared to an inch or 2 inches or 12 inches of armor steel, ends up actually being more dense than the armor steel, then you might as well have just gone with the armor steel purely on that basis. Never mind the volume issues. The other problem is, of course, that a non-Newtonian fluid is very resistive when it is being hit, but once that hit is over, it's going to drain out of the hole in the hull, which basically means it's a one and done deal unless you put a cellular system in there as well, which then makes things even more complicated. So I think some kind of like honeycombed non-Newtonian fluid would probably be, if anything, probably be a better solution for maybe things like splinter protection or protection against machine gun bullets and stuff, for use in the superstructure. rather than as a main armour piece. Dunk the Rational asks, loved to see the wild rack sharp in the arrows versus armour videos from Todd's workshop. Yes, as I say, it was huge fun to be there. And I've got a few souvenirs from that whole thing, which unfortunately, well, I stuck one of them up and it promptly fell down, so I'm currently working on a more secure hanging for it, which would be over there anyway, so that'd be in a different video. And yeah, some of the others I could just show you, but one of them I want to show you specifically in a video that I want to do, that's going to kind of comment on the Arrows versus Armour 2 video and show you how exactly it relates to naval warfare. Because, well, it relates to naval warfare in two ways. One, more directly, longbows versus armour wasn't just a thing on land, it was also a thing in 13th, 14th, 15th century naval warfare. That's why we have so many arrows and bows on the Mary Rose wreck, which is where I was yesterday, incidentally. And also, specifically from this test, the nature of the materials testing. If you've seen the materials testing video when they're shooting at different types of steel plate, and also where they show the different types of arrowhead being used, whether you're using just iron, case hardened iron, steel, etc. And then how the iron heads and the case hardened heads interacted with the breastplate and the helmet. All of that actually has direct application to the way that both naval armour and naval shells were developed, and how they are then used to attack. Well, these shells are used to attack the armour. But the wonderful thing about the Arrows versus Armour 2 video is that it, compared to trying to explain everything about the ballistics of shells and fuses and timers and explosives and all sorts of things like that, longbow versus knight's plate armour is, comparatively speaking, a wonderfully simple interaction, which means that I'm hoping to be able to use it as the basis to talk about some of the basics of armour penetration when it comes to shells versus armour, without having to get involved in the whole fuses and time delays and everything. Because remember, apart from anything else, the very earliest armour penetrating shells that we used were armour penetrating shot, things like Palliser shot and so forth. They were solid without any explosive. I mean, okay, explosive armour piercing shells came out fairly quickly, but again, the principles of the armour penetration to deliver the payload are pretty much on a par. Sapper Ninja says, I'm on a motorbike. Well, congratulations. Hope you don't fall over. Anyway, in 2007, a Somali pirate skiff attacked a Ticonderoga and a Burke. Is this the most one-sided battle ever, or can you beat it? That would take some doing. I don't know what the armament of the Somali pirate skiff is, though, because in theory, if they were carrying something that at least on paper could have inflicted some kind of damage on them, on the Ticonderoga and the Burke, like maybe someone had an RPG or something, then technically something like, you know, ships, boats trying to do a cutting out operation versus a ship that spotted them would be more one-sided. But yeah, that's got to be up there for fairly one-sided battles. Fleet of Oceans asks, are you going to do a double live stream feature at the end of next month, or slot one live stream into the middle of this month, or something else entirely? So this is because we've got to catch up with episode 219's live stream and then get on to 223's, which technically speaking should have been tonight's, but you know, have to do them in order. So what have we got? We have 5 Saturdays next month. Now, I don't want to be doing a live stream every weekend because that'd be annoying for everybody. So I think as a placeholder, I'm going to say I'm going to try and do 219's live stream on the 10th, I'm going to try and do 223's live stream. That's this weekend's Patreon Drydock on the 24th, Saturday the 24th. And then that means that we'll be caught up during December, which means when we get to the 31st of December - 1st of January, and whatever episode Patreon Drydock we're doing then hopefully I'll be able to do the corresponding live stream on that day. So yeah, that's my plan anyway. Things have been difficult behind the scenes recently, which is why we're so behind with these live streams. Then we've got right, so there's that. Sherman 117. If during the Battle of the North Cape, Duke of York didn't get a lucky boiler hit on Scharnhorst, do you think she would have gotten away? And what does the Royal Navy do if she gets back to Norway? Well, if she gets back to Norway, she's going to get hit by 617 or 9 Squadron with a tall boy sooner or later. But if Duke of York doesn't get the boiler hit, is she going to get away? I don't think so, because she has multiple cruisers with radar tracking her at this point. Even if Duke of York herself isn't fast enough to catch her, if she's got up to full speed and she doesn't get the boiler hit, okay, the destroyers are going to struggle to catch her because of the weather, but the cruisers can, Belfast, Jamaica, maybe Norfolk if she gets up to speed and gets everything fixed. Sheffield was having engine issues, but there's multiple cruisers out there with radar who can just keep tracking and following her, and Duke of York can then use their information to reposition herself to cut her off again, which is pretty much what she'd already done. So it would extend the battle, certainly, but I don't think, given the number of forces chasing Scharnhorst, I don't think she would have gotten away. Hendog 1000 says, as a self-confessed boot nerd, have you ever considered doing a Wednesday video on the evolution of footwear for sailors in at least the Royal Navy, if not most of the major navies through to the 1950s? To be honest, I haven't. It might be an interesting thing to do, but it would probably either involve me hunting down a bunch of different naval period reenactment groups with a slightly odd request of, can I use your shoes? Or hunting down... Well, actually, I don't need to hunt down. I know someone, actually, who does a whole range of historical footwear for reenactment, and just commissioning them to make a bunch of them to show people. And then probably finding a ship's deck for me to run around in and then comment on how comfortable or not they are. Although, considering that not wearing shoes at all was an option that was carried through for quite a lot of the time period, I'm not necessarily sure that would be a family-friendly episode, because you'd have to watch me running around barefoot. I'm not quite a hobbit, but still. Todd Webb, does Drac have any interest in motorcycles? Yes, to a degree. I like the idea of motorcycles. I like their utility. I'm not necessarily sure about some of people, because the problem is in the UK, most of the motorcycle use that you see either tends to be what we would call a moped, i.e. a small kind of 50cc-ish vehicle which people use to sort of tootle around in the urban areas, or you see some lunatic on, an extremely high power motorcycle who thinks that tearing down the motorway at 160 is somehow, smart and not an interesting way to turn themselves into a jam smear. And given that I spent quite a few months working with fatal accidents during my history as a engineer in what at the time Highways England called Area 6, I know what happens in considerably more detail than most to motorcyclists who decide that they are going to go very, very fast and then encounter an object that's not moving at all at high speed. So, yeah, between that and just generally the roads in the UK, I like motorcycles in principle, but I doubt I'm ever going to be riding one seriously on a public road. In fact, my dad used to ride a motorcycle to work to save time, money, and fuel, but he gave up on it after probably about 5 years, largely on the basis that it was getting too dangerous out on the roads. And I don't think it's improved all that much since. You really don't actually see that many motorcycles on UK roads anymore. You hear them occasionally, usually some spotty 16-year-old tearing up and down the street because he thinks it's cool at 1 in the morning. But yeah, they're not actually very, very common. Ken R 1800 asks, what if von Spee split his squadron up and gets them to go solo like Emden? What are the effects on World War One, and could the High Seas Fleet have a chance at a breakout due to the Royal Navy being tied up chasing raiders? To the latter, no. There just aren't enough ships in von Spee's squadron to distract the Grand Fleet. There's more than enough cruisers that the Royal Navy already has deployed to deal with most of von Spee's squadron. I mean, basically anything that's not a Scharnhorst is probably going to lose one way or the other when it comes up against most of the Royal Navy cruisers that they have out there, because pretty much everything that in von Spee's squadron that isn't the Scharnhorst is 4.1 inch armed. So even a Monmouth, like there were 2 at the Falkland Islands, is more than capable of hunting them down. And Town class light cruisers, etc., still more than capable of besting them, as Sydney proved against Emden. It would cause havoc amongst shipping lanes, but the simple fact is the Royal Navy has considerably more cruisers available out there to hunt those German protected cruisers down than they need, really. The big elephant in the room is going to be the 2 Scharnhorst, because they are capable of taking on anything pretty much that isn't a last generation British armoured cruiser or 2. They would be a major issue, but there are only 2 of them, and if they're on their own, then the Invincibles that were sent down there can split up, and defence probably is also going to be in the area. I suspect the Royal Navy might just stick a bunch of older pre-dreadnoughts like Canopus on convoy escort duty, because we know that even with his entire squadron, von Spee didn't want to fight Canopus, so much less so is a single Scharnhorst going to try and engage one. But if you've got to hunt down each and every single one of them, it's going to require an awful lot of the Royal Navy's overseas and second line forces to do, and it's going to take a lot longer, to hunt them all down. Jason Roth asks, how would the war in the Atlantic be changed by the addition of 2 fully modernised Der Flinger and 2 Mackensen-class battlecruisers to the Kriegsmarine, and what would the ships look like post-refit? Well, I mean, fully modernised Der Flingers and Mackenzens, I don't think they're going to change their main guns, but if they're fully modernised, replacing all the casement guns with deck-mounted weaponry, given that we're talking about fully modernised with pre-existing Kriegsmarine equipment, that probably means a mixture of 150s and 105s, plus your 37s and 20s. They're probably going to delete the underwater torpedo tubes, and they're going to have to update the forward superstructure to accommodate radar and additional rangefinders and so on and so forth. But I don't think their visual appearance would be massively changed, actually. The single biggest obvious visual change will be having faired in or rebuilt the hull around where the casements are, and switch that over to deck mounted secondaries in turrets or mounts, shielded mounts. That's going to be the single biggest change in appearance, I think. And possibly also maybe having single large trunked funnels for the more modern propulsion systems. But if Germany's got 4 fully modernized battle cruisers in addition to Scharnhorst, etc., that is going to be a problem, because the Royal Navy doesn't have that many fast battleships. The flip side is, the old battleship escorts are still more than capable of scaring them off, because the Scharnhorsts, the Scharnhorsts weren't going to take them on. The Deflingers certainly aren't. The main thing is going to be, can Germany find all the fuel to run them all? But yeah, if they go out with sort of Operation Berlin and stuff, 6 battle cruisers out there, or 4 battle cruisers and 2 small light battleships, could quite easily shut down the convoy system. If they all go out alone, so they go out together but split up and attack all over the place. The single biggest risk would be if they try and operate all together as a group, because if they try and operate all together as a group, that means the Royal Navy can concentrate on them, and there's more Royal Navy ships out there. So yeah, you don't want to concentrate, you want to scatter to the 4 winds. That might mean 1 or 2 get picked off in isolation, but the majority will survive. Which is basically prey animal fleeing from predator instinct, I just realised. 000.000. What if 1 or more of these happened at North Cape? Scharnhorst did not misidentify Norfolk, Scharnhorst radar was not knocked out, and the German destroyers were not sent away. Well, there's various combinations thereof are, I think, probably too numerous to enumerate in a live stream answer. But if Scharnhorst doesn't misidentify Norfolk, then, I mean, would she turn away? It's still 3 cruisers, and they can hurt her with torpedoes if she tries to close in. I don't think she'd probably run. She would probably alter course and try and fight it out, because Scharnhorst would be aware that the 6-inch guns certainly don't pose a tremendous material threat, unless they're knocking out sensitive systems. If Scharnhorst would probably then go after Norfolk first. So in actual fact, weirdly, it would be like an upgraded version of the Battle of River Plate, because at River Plate you have Graf Spee versus the 3 diminutives. You've got 2 Leanders and a York. This is now basically the same setup. You have an 11-inch armed German capital ship, except it's a slightly bigger one, and you've got 3 British cruisers, 1 heavy cruiser, 2 light cruisers, except they are also the slightly bigger ones, because you've got 2 towns and a county. So it'd be an interesting fight if Scharnhorst stuck around. Obviously, in that scenario, if Scharnhorst still gets her radar knocked out, then the cruisers have a significant advantage, because they can see her and range on her much better than Scharnhorst can. Flip side, if Scharnhorst radar isn't knocked out, so we're treating them all separately. So let's assume she's misidentified Norfolk, she's pulled away, but her radar hasn't been knocked out. She might well avoid the trap, or at least have a better chance of fighting back in the trap that Duke of York set for her, because she might pick up Duke of York and then either open fire based on that radar, or thus forcing Duke of York to open fire at longer range as well, or else spot Duke of York and start manoeuvring to try and avoid Duke of York, which would lead to an interesting game of cat and mouse, which one side or the other may not win. The slight problem that Scharnhorst would have at that point is that the more she plays dodge left and dodge right with Duke of York, the closer the pursuing cruisers can get behind her and try and pincer her. But there is a possibility if she does something like, brake to port and accelerate to full speed, she might just be able to try and do an end run around Duke of York. I mean, Duke of York has the inside track, which somewhat negates the speed advantage, but Scharnhorst might be able to disappear off into the murk. If the German destroyers weren't sent away, to be honest, I don't think they would have had a huge effect in the battle. You look at, even the cruisers were being hampered by the weather. The British destroyers were being very badly hampered by the weather, and the German destroyers were already top heavy, not particularly suited for this kind of operation. So if they were present, it probably would have been a little bit like Lofoten again, where the big boys go into play and the destroyers are kind of left playing catch up until the end. So of the three, the first two probably are the ones that cause the biggest changes. The Stoned Abbot asks, if you could go back in time to see your hometown in any period, which era would you choose? Well, I don't really have that much of a choice, because my hometown was lavender fields about 150 years ago. So it didn't meaningfully exist. So I know a V1 landed a few roads down from where I grew up in the Second World War. I'd probably go back to kind of like the late 1900s, early 1910s, just for the laugh of it, because that's about the earliest time it would be recognisable as a semi-decent town, to be perfectly honest. Budguy8829 asks, why did it take so long for warships to have all their main guns on the centreline? Outside of a couple of interesting cases of wanting as many guns pointing forward for chase fire, the two main reasons were either, and this was especially the case with the British, what you call sighting hoods, so places where people can look out and try and see what's going on outside of the turret. So if you look at Dreadnought or her contemporaries in the Royal Navy, you'll notice that there are these two kind of like little ear or eye things poking up out of the turret roof. Those are the sighting hoods, and there were semi-legitimate concerns about super-firing turrets firing over those and the blast, knocking out the men in the turret below, or at least severely inconveniencing them. But the more broadly, if you're looking at navies across the world, it would be, what's the best way to describe it? Lack of deck space. Because first you had vertical triple expansion engines, which took up a lot of volume, and therefore there's a lot of funnels. A lot of the real estate down the centreline was already taken up by machinery, therefore you just couldn't have all your main guns on the centreline because there wasn't the space to put them. And then later on, even once you went over to turbines, if you wanted proper high power, high speed turbines before the advent of gearing and various other things, the earlier turbine sets, it was still very difficult to find enough space on the centreline for all your main guns. And so the wing turrets persisted, because you could put guns out on the wing turret, on the wings, but you couldn't fit them on the centreline because it was occupied by machinery. Megapixel asks, and I think this is the last super chat at the moment. I think we've caught up with them all. He says, I've always been amused by, or amazed by, how little keel blocks are necessary to dry dock even some of the largest ships ever. Have there ever been any documented cases of catastrophic failures of such blocks or other constructs in the dry docks? Yes. Yes, they have. And it usually doesn't end well because either the support framing or the keel block failing means the ship just drops, in which case you can break the keel of a ship doing that, at which point it's totaled. So you then have a twofold problem. One, the ship's broken. Two, the ship's stuck in your dry dock. And obviously flooding the dry dock to get the ship you've just broken out of the dry dock probably isn't going to help matters. So you end up having to do a ton of patchwork on basically a wreck just to try and get the wreck out of your dry dock. In even worse cases, the collapse can mean the ship rolls over, and then it's an even worse problem because not only is the ship a wreck and it's filling your dry dock, it's now on its side or upside down and really in a place it really should not be. Probably taking further damage because it wasn't put over time because it's not supposed to be that way. And sometimes it can also, fall on another ship that was in there if it's a smaller ship. That actually happened in the not in as a result of the Pearl Harbor attack, but in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor in early 1942. There was one of the US submarines was in dry dock awaiting repairs, and there was a failure of the support structure, and she fell over onto her side, and I think fell onto either another sub or a destroyer possibly, which was a bit inconvenient. The only lucky break they had there was that it was being a submarine, it was within the realm of possibility to just crane the thing up, and rearrange things. Whereas some of the bigger failures, you can write off a full-scale warship that way. Craig Binder asks, New Jersey didn't really sink an island, did it? It depends what you mean by sink. You can't sink an island because an island is not afloat. An island does not have buoyancy. You can't put holes in the bottom of an island for it to keel over and slip beneath the water. You can blow up substantial portions of the above water portion of a small island, but which, if you reduce the island to mostly sea level, technically has removed it from the landscape, at which point there's now just a rock outcrop just under the water level. But yeah, you can't literally sink an island unless it's on the back of a turtle or something like that, in which case you get arrested for animal cruelty. Frank Spazzato asks, other than South Dakota, what other ships do you know go into battle without all their weapons working, and are they on the winning side? Well, without drawing on modern examples, Prince of Wales, they're still trying to get things working running into the battle, and obviously things kept breaking. She wasn't on the winning side of the Battle of Denmark Strait. What else? Various Age of Sail ships would usually go into battle just through sheer luck of the draw. If you've got 70 to 100 plus guns on your ship, statistically one or two of them are probably not working or have issues at the time you go into a fight. Lion. Well, she didn't really go into battle because she wasn't involved in any major battles after Jutland, but for a long time after Jutland, she was sailing around with only 3 turrets because Q turret was first semi-blanked off and then completely removed. She didn't actually get Q turret back till right towards the end of World War One, and that's actually one of the ways you can date a picture of HMS Lion. If she's either got the gun house but not the guns, or if she's got nothing or next to nothing in place of Q turret, then she is in that kind of late 1916, 1917 time period. But let's make sure I've got the questions here. And then, towards the end of the war, towards the end of World War II, some of the German and Japanese ships were sailing into action with not all of their weaponry working. Oh, and Warspite, when she rocked up off of D-Day, the aft turret that had taken the hit from the Fritz X wasn't working and never would work again, so she was down to 6 guns. Budguy8829 asks, did the US Navy's capital ships ever have a close call with meeting German capital ships in either of the world wars? Yes. Yes, they did. So US capital ships, I believe, were present in the area when Tirpitz made its one and only major sortie. The US wasn't involved directly in the war when Bismarck sailed. Excuse me. And in the First World War, there were obviously a number of sorties by the High Seas Fleet after Jutland, and in one of those abortive sorties, 6th Battle Squadron, aka the US battleships, was actually at the lead of the Royal Navy formation because of the way the manoeuvres shook out. So if that had gone full on, then at that point the US Navy would have actually been leading the Grand Fleet into battle, which would have been quite fun to see. Right, so let's see. So, excuse me, basically the limitation on this is going to be Iron Brew and my voice. Right, so excuse me, I'm just trying to get my throat working again. Alexander Steele asks, and I'm going to start taking questions at this point. So yeah, if you can identify the question, then past that is when I'm going to start reading questions. Anyway, you get the idea. So what's your preferred convention for coming up with new, not recycled ship names? Okay, for that it would be, I prefer the idea of identify a theme and then run with it. The big problem, if you're coming up with new names, is that most of the good ones have already been used, often repeatedly, even if not necessarily by your navy. At which point, I guess they might be new to you, but personally, I don't like the trend of naming ships after people unless those people are very notable naval officers. I can understand with some navies why they might do it, because they might be relatively new navies, so they're naming them after generals as well. But naming ships after just anyone vaguely significant in that country's history, especially when they might not have anything to do with the sea or their politicians, I don't like that. So I think broadly speaking, you either have to choose a theme and go with that. So theme names, I think, work very well for fast attack craft and submarines. Then you could also go with very historical figures. So big historical figures would be good for larger ship names, capital ship names, etc. So like, when the Koreans go with Sejong the Great, or something like that. That's a good way of doing ship names, or delving into your local mythos. So for the British, we've got Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. If we want to go mythology, we've got Alfred. If we want to go old school history, but real, etc., etc. And then for the mid-range stuff, so in the period that the channel covers things like cruisers and so forth, I guess these days maybe frigates and stuff. If you're going with a new name generation, I think either the US approach dash the sort of county town approach of naming them after your country's notable towns or governmental areas is probably as good as any. Because as I say, otherwise things like superlatives and action and nouns and such, most of those have already been done, which is kind of a problem. Sorry, it's getting a bit cold in here. I really should have brought a fleece. Bunker housing, what does your shirt say? It says, your call may be recorded for training purposes. USS Grey Ghost asks, could 6 or 8 depth charges going off under the Yamato's keel have broken her back if they all went off at the same time and were close enough together that one of them blowing up causes the others to go off? Depends entirely on what depth charges and what depth setting they're set at. If they're small depth charges set it to go off at 300 to 400 feet, then no. If they're the biggest kinds of depth charges being carried on World War II ships and they're fused to go off at like 30 to 50 feet, the closest to the surface that you can get, then I don't know if they'd break her back unless they were very, 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 very lucky in their exact placement underneath her, but they'd certainly do a heck of a lot of damage because, group half a dozen of the biggest depth charges and let's say they go off at 40 foot, that's going to be a warhead considerably larger than the biggest torpedo, and it's doing an under keel detonation at the equivalent depth of a deep running torpedo. Someone spotted the Star Fury. Jonathan Truswell asks, if you had to pick naval streamers and YouTube content makers for your admirals and commanders during World War II, who would you pick? Well, I mean, I don't know anyone who does naval streaming all that often outside of Killer Bin, I think. Well, I know a few of the World of Warship streams. There's TC Freer and so forth, but that it's a relatively small pool. So if I've got to pick admirals and commanders, by default I have to pick them because there's not a lot of them that I know, and I'm not picking people I don't know because who knows what they could do. And the same with the kind of content creators. Basically, for the most part, look at the people I've collaborated with. Let's put it this way: I haven't had a collaboration with any other of the naval content makers on YouTube that I've disliked. I've liked all of them. Whether or not they liked me is another matter. I don't know. Hopefully they did. But yeah, I mean they're all pretty decent. And to be honest, if I haven't worked with a particular YouTube naval content creator yet, it may be that I'm going to do in the future. It may be that I just haven't got round to it. And to be fair, there are 1 or 2 content creating channels on YouTube which I wouldn't touch with a 10-foot barge pole. Without naming any particular channel, I'm sorry, but when you call the Admiral Hippers a pocket battleship whilst showing a picture of a movie picture of a Scharnhorst, you need to up your game slightly. It's yeah. Just a bit sad that people seem to like watching that kind of thing. I guess it's because they're pretty moving pictures in it or something. Hunter of Bats. I really enjoyed the video on the R-Class. The R-Class subs. Yes, the Hunter Killers. What would have happened if Britain had continually developed them into the Second World War? Now, that would have been very interesting because, yeah, the R-Class, I think, as a few people have been pointing out in that video, they are a bit of a huge missed opportunity. They're very early form Hunter Killers. I think basically the reason they get gotten rid of is this whole thing of like, we don't think there's going to be a war for 10 years, and unlike other subs which can do all sorts of interesting things, the R class are basically monopurpose. They are, I mean, sure, you could use an R class to hunt enemy surface ships and stuff, but they are designed for and optimized for the hunting of any enemy submarines. If you don't think you're going to be in a war with enemy submarines to hunt, then why have them? If Britain had gone, actually, well, you know, we probably do want a submarine hunting class. I mean, Britain had the ability to build some pretty nice small subs like the U's and the P's. But what would they do? Just trying to think. If Britain had gone into the Second World War with kind of a modern R class, a modern hunter killer, you probably, given the trend that was evident with the T class and their strong desire to have a maximum forward salvo, combined with the fact that the R class had already kind of embraced that, you probably would be looking at like an 8 torpedo forward salvo. You probably can't get 10 because 10 was with the T class, and even then some of them, the tubes were one shot. It's going to have to remain small. If they continue to develop the spindle hull and run with that, obviously hydrophones have improved. It would now have sonar, active sonar, i.e. ASDIC, so it wouldn't just have to listen, it could actually ping for its opponents. And who knows, I mean, they were thinking of having what we would today call a passive towed array, at that point a hydrophone on the end of a line, in World War One. So if during peacetime they'd developed that, they could have had an absolutely lethal thing. That would have been... It would have been very interesting. I think at that point you probably would have seen R class assigned to the Channel and to patrolling off the Bay of Biscay to try and hunt U-boats on their way out to attack convoys, because they would have a actually, you know, near perfect IFF in the form of a sonar, their own sonar. So, you know, you possibly could have multiple R class, not necessarily operating together, but certainly operating in the same area, if your doctrine called for your subs to go and then ping their target before accelerating into attack speed, or accelerate to attack speed and then ping to get a final bearing and range to launch your torpedoes, because then, as at that point the only sub with an onboard sonar in 1939, if they accidentally are launching an attack on a friendly, the friendly can ping back and like, okay, we won't launch torpedoes at this. That would be a really interesting, both to try and design up a 1930s R class and then imagine what they might do trying to hunt U-boats. Knight 6831 says, in the 1930s, Airspeed Limited had a license to build the Douglas DC-2 as the Airspeed AS-23, and if I think this is a hypothetical. If they go for it, how does this benefit the British in World War II? They have a relatively nice twin-engine transport plane. I mean, it's not like the British didn't have. I mean, it's not. I don't think it's going to have a huge effect because it's not like the British didn't have some pretty decent twin-engine transport planes of their own. The big thing that came with the DC-3-C-47 was the fact that the Americans could build so many of them. I mean, the DC-3, DC-47 is a pretty decent, and the DC-2 as well before it. They're good transports. Don't get me wrong, but you're throwing one of many good transports with the license of one company into a mix, which in some ways might make things slightly worse because it now means you've got an additional set of aircraft with their own maintenance requirements to work with. Whereas one of the big strengths of the DC-3 and its derivatives was just they show up in such large numbers. It would be of some benefit, but it's not anything particularly war changing, I think. Tom asks, how effective would Palmerston's Follies have been? Additionally, how long was it before they were obsolete? They're good at notifying. They're good at scaring off. They would have been good at scaring off the odd raider here and there. In terms of resisting a mass incoming invasion force, well, they'll last until they're either captured by landing forces or, blown off the face of the map. But they'd pull off a degree of delaying action, which, to be honest, that's mainly what they were supposed to be. Keep off the riff-raff raiders and delay anything major long enough for a response further inland to be mustered. But in terms of how long before they were obsolete, this is in a lot of ways down to how obsolete you think shore fortifications are and how effective you think they are in the first place. I'm personally a not particular great fan of shore fortifications in general, although there are some areas where they're a little bit more effective than not. But in terms of fortifications in and of themselves, as long as you keep their equipment updated, technically speaking, they probably aren't really going to be obsolete until a good 10 years into the ironclad era, when you've got some, shells that can really shells and shot that can really take them apart in a big way. Albeit, again, even then, you have to balance that against the capabilities of the navy that's attacking to actually hit them in the first place. Which, well, let's just say the bombardment of Alexandria showed that you could have some of the world's biggest guns, but, good luck to you if you can't actually hit anything. That was a big jump. What's going on? Scroll. Okay. Bunker housing, are you going to do a reaction to Sabaton's song about Bismarck? Not really. It's a nice enough song, but it's a song, the artistic license, etc. Plus, to be honest, whilst all of Sabaton's songs obviously have to have, don't have to have, but one of Sabaton's signature bits is they always have a chorus. My only general criticism of the song as a song is that the choral elements of it are just perhaps a little bit more repetitive than you get in a lot of their other songs. But by the time I finished listening to it, I was not left in any doubt that Bismarck was a Kriegsmarine ship. Put it that way. Uh, Mr. Serenity's End asks, what would be your ideal plan to keep up British shipbuilding during the treaty system? Um, Realistically, the only way you're going to save the upper end of things like gun and armour manufacturing to a scale which won't leave you in the problems the British were having in the late 1930s would probably be some kind of resolve by the government in the late 1920s not to try and extend the treaty system. They might revise it, but not to extend the battleship building holiday, because if they are now determined that, you know, when the 10-year window discussed at Washington expires, they're going to build new things, which means they're going to build 16A. That means that they have to start building, testing guns and constructing and compiling armour at the very end of the 1920s and the beginning of the 1930s, which might just about allow some, if not all, of the industry that was lost to keep going on the basis of that. Squirrel Jenkins asks, did India have a navy of any significance in the World War I, World War II era? There was the Royal Indian Navy, or Royal Indian Naval Service, depending on who was writing what. But no, it wasn't of any particular significance. Basically, coastal craft, escort craft for convoys. Yeah, nothing of any particularly great note, unfortunately, for the Indians. But, well, as the Canadian fleet proved, you don't necessarily have to have big ships to have a significant effect on the war. But one, the Indian Ocean, although it did have U-boats in it, was not the most dangerous of oceans, and two, the Indian Navy stayed relatively small. And Frank Sposato asks, in an attempt to prevent war pre-World War One, all the powers make a Paris Naval Treaty in 1914. What approaches may be taken if similar to the Washington Treaty? If they're serious about preventing World War One and they want to get Germany and Britain back on something closer to friendly terms, which, to be fair, the French and the Russians are probably determined to sabotage, but never mind, you'd probably have to go with a kind of basically getting the two-power standard back. Britain would probably insist on it, and which basically means suspending most German capital ship construction. Who exactly becomes the second power is also interesting, because by 1914 the third largest fleet in terms of modern dreadnoughts either built or under construction is actually the US Navy. So yeah, I'd love to see the negotiations of some kind of two-power standard where the US and Germany are the two powers that the British are going to have the same number of ships as combined. That would be interesting, to say the least. Of course, yeah, armament-wise, I guess they might try and cap it at 15 inches, because that's, again, the kind of the size of the gun that everybody's building up to at that point. But you see, the biggest problem with a Paris Naval Treaty in 1914 is that the only reason the Washington Treaty got through was because the British basically didn't want to get into another naval arms race. And the reason I specifically mentioned them is because they were the biggest navy. They were going to have to climb down and accept someone on parity. If they thought they could sustain the building race, or if the government was determined to do so, then they wouldn't have acceded to the Washington Treaty. And indeed, the reason the Americans went in for the Washington Treaty was in large part because of their changing government to a more isolationist one. Whereas 1914, pre-World War One, the Royal Navy is the pinnacle of British power. The British don't have World War One, having taken away a lot of their money, etc. So they are going to be going in at it from a position of the only way this treaty is acceptable to us is if we get back our two-power standard position without any real argument, which is going to make it a difficult one, because if the Kaiser and or the US want to make any inroads on that, then the British are probably just going to turn around and say, no, we'll just keep building. Thank you very much, Bunker Housing, and I hope you have a good night. Sean Riley says, hey Drac, any chance of a video on the salvage of Leonardo da Vinci? Also, what's your opinion on the reenactment of the Battle of Drydock Sound from the movie The King's Choice? So The King's Choice is actually a really good little clip of the Battle of Drydock Sound. From what I can recall of it, the placement of shots and the way things went up and the torpedo, etc., are pretty close to what legitimately happened to Blücher. Now, I've only seen extracts of it, and of course it is a film that's not just about the naval combat, it's got much larger implications. So I don't know if they then follow it up with showing what happened to Lutzow following along and the rest of the naval unit, etc. But for the bit that I've seen, I have a pretty good opinion of it. In terms of a video about the salvage of Leonardo da Vinci, I can give it a go. It will have to be a little bit down the line though, because I've got I have my tentative schedule for Wednesday videos, which is this is what I'd like to do, which is several months long. And I don't mean that as in like I've only got several months worth of topics. I've got years and years of topics, but I've got several months worth of, I'd like to do this topic on this week. And I've got about 2-month list of, this is definitively what I'm planning on doing. So these are the scripts I need to finish up. But even then, one of those is being pushed back a little bit. One or two, I think, actually. There's some rather interesting interviews coming up, I think. Spoiler alert, Admiral Fisher Part 2 is next week. That'll be a series I actually completed in reasonable time. I think that'll be the first time that happened since the Pearl Harbor one. Jamie Peter asks, World War II Merchant Navy series. It seems like an interesting time of transition between coal and diesel and the convoys. That'll be a little bit harder because the Merchant Navy, I know some stuff about it. I don't know as much as I'd like to. So I don't know about a Merchant Navy series specifically. There will eventually be a series on the Battle of the Atlantic and how that all shook out, eventually. And maybe that will be peppered with sort of sidelines into explaining things like Liberty ships, Victory ships, the differences between those two, the standard merchant ships, etc. But that's one of the reasons why it'd be a really big series, because it'll probably need those sort of scene setting videos, so I don't have to explain what the difference is between the different tankers and high speed merchant ships and standard speed merchant ships and so on and so forth. Oh, it's getting a bit it really is getting a bit chilly in here, and it's almost midnight, so let's see where we get to. HMS Belfast asks, Royal Navy punishments during World War One. I have a family member who went AWOL and got 30 days detention. Was he lucky, or were the rules of the time quite lax compared to the army? I think it depends on how long he went AWOL for. if it was a case of, you know, went on shore leave, didn't show up on time, had to go out and find him the next morning, and found him, you know, asleep in a gutter or something, then, well, 30 days detention is maybe a little bit on the harsh side. If, on the other hand, it was, supposed to report for duty today, you know, had gone to bed in his hammock, but had snuck off the ship during the night, and we had to spend 2 weeks hunting him across the country, then 30 days of detention will be pretty lucky. 96831. What damage would exploding 4-inch anti-aircraft ammunition actually do to a ship other than a severe fire? Depends how much of it and where it's going, where it is, because of course Hood was near enough certainly sunk by the 4-inch magazine kicking off, which then kicks off the 15-inch. So that's a lot of damage. But that's a lot of 4-inch ammo in a confined space. Whereas if you're, you know, if you, I don't know, the ready use lockers or something catch fire on the upper deck, well, just go the other side of the ship, because there's not a huge amount of explosive in a 4-inch shell. Okay, the charge has a bit more bang in it, but effectively you've got kind of small-ish HE shells kind of going off, and without the, you know, the impact of an actual shell flying around. It's just a series of explosions. So if you've got ready use lockers high up in the ship cooking off, then as long as you're not in the direct line of sight for shrapnel, you're probably fine. You know, just put a couple of decent bulkheads between you and the fire and wait for it to die out. Your only real risk would be if the fire spreads either enough to start setting off more lockers in a chain reaction. That would be irritating. Or if it spreads violently enough or explodes, then the shrapnel goes in the right directions to cripple the 4-inch anti-aircraft guns that are nearby. Vicky McDonough, armoured cruiser fight. Georges, Averof and 2 Minotaurs versus Blucher and 2 Scharnhorsts. Much as I like the Averof, I think Blucher and the 2 Scharnhorsts have the advantage there. I mean, the Minotaurs have a firepower advantage over the Scharnhorsts in principle, in terms of numbers of guns, and also the fact that the if you like, the wing guns on the Scharnhorsts, the sort of wing casement mounted big guns, have a limited elevation. So especially at long range, the Minotaurs have that going for them. But the Scharnhorsts are a little bit tougher, and of course, as the range closes and those shorter range guns come into effect, then they get more and more lethal. And yeah, Averof is good, it's not Blucher good. So the main thing is that even if the Minotaurs have something of an advantage over the Scharnhorsts, and, you know, defense was what Graf Spee worried about, defense for good reason, I think Blucher is likely to finish off its opponent, and then it's going to come and help one of the Scharnhorsts and kind of roll the whole thing up that way. Lots of discussion about names of ships going on. Grey Ghost asking, was there any good ship classes that were designed by committee? Depends how you define designed by committee. Most ships were, at least in the main period the channel covers, certainly once you get past the pre-Dreadnought, well, into the pre-Dreadnought and after phase, most of those ships were technically designed by committee in as much as there were multiple high-ranking officers who would have input into the designs. But at the same time, you know, they would ask for options, they would be given options, and then they would choose between those options and occasionally ask for, you know, this measure from this option to be incorporated into this other measure, as opposed to a committee sitting down and going, we are going to design the ultimate ship ever, which occasionally did happen, and yeah, to be fair, most of the time that went very badly. Derp Squad asking, Dr. Clark Drac drama when? I don't think there's going to be all that much drama, to be perfectly honest. Not well, unless my fluffy research assistant, which hopefully we will be acquiring at some point in the first half of next year, I don't know, eats a corgi or something. That might cause some drama. Broken Wolf 668. If World of Warships asked, would you voice a special captain? Sure, why not? It'd be quite fun. I'd have to think of things to say. Yeah, sorry, John Buchman. I am relatively tired, so this is kind of the little tics I get when I'm tired, and I start rubbing my eyes to try and keep myself awake, and I start sort of stroking my beard to. It's just a thing that helps keep me up and around. That's a Leonardo da Vinci question again. Aminak says, didn't the T-class have a set of torpedo tubes outside the pressure hull? They had several, actually. Yes, this was kind of the thing. The T-class could fire a 10 torpedo salvo forward. At least the early ones could. Once. After that, you were down to, well, the two uppermost torpedoes on the bow were definitely one-shotters unless you got into port or somewhere to reload them. You certainly weren't reloading them while you're underwater. And the amidships launchers, I think there was some capability to reload them, but not in action, if you like. So if you snuck up on something and fired your 10 torpedo salvo underwater forward, you were basically down to 6 torps on your reload while you were actively in that engagement, with the possibility, if I recall, albeit not usually exercised, the possibility to reload the waste tubes, i.e. the ones amidships. That could be done, whereas I don't think that reloading the uppermost forward tubes could be done realistically while you're at sea. I could be slightly mistaken on that, but I'm pretty sure I've read at least one account of them at least trying to reload the amidships tubes. Derp Squad asks, do you think that the world a World War II R-class submarine development would have led to early forms of wire-guided torpedoes during World War II. I don't see why not. They, as I mentioned before, they had wire-guided torpedoes in the 19th century as harbour defence weapons, so that wasn't an unknown. And if, at least in principle, and if they were going to use ASDIC, i.e. active sonar, as a guidance, then at least a short-run wire-guided torpedo system might well be considered, because that would mean that you could fire your torpedoes whilst still manoeuvring, and even if it was only a few hundred yards, you could then at least get them pointed on course before the wires cut and off they go. Knight 6831, would I be right that to fix Warspite's steering problem would need her steering gear to be completely replaced? Possibly. You'd have to figure out where the heck the steering problem came from, because it may be a mounting or something like that. They never really got to the bottom of it. So you could replace the steering gear entirely, but if it was a mounting or a shaft casing that was actually causing the problem, then even replacing the actual mechanical system wouldn't help. You would have to actually replace the portion of the hull that it passed through. No. Amnuk says, what, you're getting a wolfhound? Close. We're hoping to get a deerhound. They're like wolfhounds, just slightly smaller. And when I say slightly, I do mean slightly. The main attraction is that they like running very, 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 very fast for a short period of time and then lazing around all day. As opposed to something like a Dachshund, which I love Dachshunds, but they seem to be basically non-stop energy balls, which, if you are trying to record a video for several hours a day, is not necessarily the world's best combination. PlaneNut767 says, so do you have any other hobbies that are waterborne or maritime based, like fishing, boating, canoe swimming, etc.? Water based, not hugely. I swim semi-regularly for the exercise. Fishing's never really attracted me that much. I don't know if it counts as water-based, but I do like fossil hunting on beaches and occasionally up cliffs when when I can get up a cliff or a cliff fall fast enough that when people start yelling at me that it's stupid and dangerous, I'm like, well, I'm already up here, so I'm not coming down. Come and get me if you want. I'll do that. And the thing is, of course, where I live, it's a little bit of a journey out to the coast, and let's just say I'm not particularly thrilled with the idea of going boating or canoeing in the Thames, because I'd either be run down by a garbage barge or otherwise have to be near the Thames, which, okay, it's gotten healthier. It won't kill you on contact the way it did in the Victorian times, but it's still not necessarily my favourite thing. Unless you go above the tidal area. If you go to like the Teddington, Kingston and above area, then boating up and down there can be fun at times. Oh yes, sorry, that's the pronunciation thing. Right, okay, it's 5 minutes past midnight. I'm running out of iron, and you can probably hear I'm also running out of voice, so I'm probably gonna do maybe 5-10 minutes more and then call it a night. Some people were saying it's static. Oh, the static was probably the iron brew fizzing next to the microphone. Sorry, because this setup is not my downstairs setup. I have a separate microphone that I bought, which is down here next to me. Ironically enough, which is actually theoretically better than the microphone I have connected downstairs for recording, but it uses a different cable, and because I was going to just swap. Basically, my old microphone is on a very long cable into my computer, but that microphone uses, I think I got it rightly, I think it uses micro USB, and the new one uses mini USB, or whichever other way around. Basically, they don't share cables, and I can't be bothered at the moment to get another 2-meter long audio cable and swap them all over. So the newer, slightly better microphone is up here, but because it's that, my laptop on a stand, etc., etc., it's all a bit over the place. And I just realised my iron brew is sitting next to the microphone, so probably when I poured it, all the fizzing got through. Sorry. Right, hang on. Let's try and warm up a bit. Brian419, do you have tickets to see Texas when she finishes her visit to the Drydock? I'm currently, I need in the next week or so to actually write to Texas to see if they'll let me in the Drydock in February when I'm over in the States briefly. Jeez. Okay, you know I'm tired when I'm having to squint to see the screen because my eyes are beginning to fade out. The Bobbins asked, do you have a large globe-shaped drinks cabinet in the library? No. The library is taken up with basically mostly books, some models, and a TV screen. And sorry, I'm just going to move slightly. And I don't think there's any space for a globe-shaped drink cabinet. Also, the whole room is tilted slightly because of the weight of the books, even after an RSJ was put in. So, yeah. That's definitely a thing. Just pick up the mouse again. So I just needed to move slightly to get some blood flow. Because it's getting pretty chilly over here in the UK. Not as chilly as other places, but when you're in a t-shirt and you haven't put the heating on, it does get a little cold. Would I be willing to cover USS Nautilus? Maybe. I think she's a museum ship now, so I don't know if I can get there. BR Class 47, was a Vanguard designed in such a way as in a refit, if a refit was so desired, the Royal Navy could put the Lion class guns in triple turrets as a replacement for second-hand 15-inch guns? No. No, Vanguard's barbettes were designed around the 15-inch, so triple 16s are going to need considerably larger barbettes, which basically, practically speaking, rules out replacing them. They'd just be far too large. You basically have to rebuild the entire ship, at which point you might as well build a new ship, because you'd be paying to build a new ship without the cost of ripping apart the old one. The main thing is that not only is it twin 15s as opposed to triple 16s, but also the twin 15 turret, the twin 1542 turret the Royal Navy had, was actually on, depending on how favourable you're being, you either call it on quite the efficient side or quite the small side. So yeah, you're not going to get a triple 16 in place of them. Bill Drapt asks, what are your thoughts on the Japanese attack on Sydney Harbour? Wait till I do a video on it. Stuff and things. In Age of Sail naval battles, what would you consider to be a last resort munition for cannons when traditional iron shot ran out? Anything they could get their hands on. That could be enemy ammunition that had been fired at them and that they could recover. Or obviously the various specialist shot, chain shot, bar shot, etc., etc. It's not quite Pirates of the Caribbean where you're pouring the cutlery and stuff down there. I mean, the thing is, practically speaking, if you've completely run out of iron shot in every way, shape or form, and the enemy shot isn't really available, etc., at that point you're probably just going to surrender or sail away. If you absolutely were just like, no, we're going to fire everything we've still got gunpowder around somehow, ballast stones would probably be the next thing to go for. Let's see. I don't understand that question entirely. The grammar's a bit wrong, so I'm going to move on from that. Darren Running asks, if Japan manages to save Akagi and Hiryu at the Battle of Midway, do they then proceed with the conversions in order to make up for the loss of Kaga and Soryu? Yeah, they're still going to do the conversion. They may not do Shinano. They may, but if they've lost Shoho at Coral Sea, Shikaku and Zuikaku have been attacked at various points, or lost their air groups, depending on which one you're looking at. And if they've also then lost Kaga and Soryu, they're going to know the Americans are building more carriers, so they're going to want as many carriers as they can, partly to make up losses and partly to increase their flight deck numbers. Sean Riley, do you ever visit heritage railways? Yes. Yeah, I do actually. I haven't done any since lockdown ended, but that was definitely something I used to do quite a lot. I like railway, steam railways at least. The general British public transport railway system, on the other hand, is something to be endured when necessary. What if I move that? Some people saying they still hear static. Hang on a second. If I... Ooh, that's not good. Move that, move that. Connection. Hello, test, test, test. And there shouldn't be any static now. Hopefully. Well, the thing is, I can't hear myself, so who knows. Okay, last three questions, I think. BR Class 47, why did the Soviet Union decide to put such a big gun on the Kirov class and not a gun more like the gun on the Italian classes it was based off of? Basically, with the Kirovs, they were trying to make a gun that had almost the firepower of a heavy cruiser gun, but with the rate of fire of a light cruiser gun, and they ended up, at least at first, with a gun that actually had the rate of fire of a battleship gun and the damage of a slightly over-egged light cruiser gun. So that didn't work out very well, even if they did eventually... They fixed the rate of fire a bit, but it took them a good long while. Excuse me. Well, I could turn the gain down, I suppose. If I turn the gain down, that might cut the static a little bit. Anyway, where were we? Now go to 2044. How's the sea mine? When can you get it? The sea mine is fine. The sea mine is currently living in the conservatory, which is probably where I might do some of the live streams in spring, summertime, but I'm definitely not doing them at the moment because it'll be about 2 degrees Celsius over there. Also, it's kind of a storeroom at the moment because of, you know, storing furniture and stuff from reconfiguring the house, as you can see some of the effects around here. David Winther Jensen, ever thought of doing a video about the Battle of Copenhagen in 1801? Yeah, I have. If I was going to do that, I'd probably do a two-parter, one with, I mean, because the thing is, Nelson's Copenhagen, Nelson's Copenhagen, I've kind of already covered in the Nelson series. So if I was going to do Copenhagen in and of itself, to avoid just looking like I'm repeating myself, I'd probably do a combination of 1801 and 1807. Okay, so right, one more question. That's not really a question, but Alnick says we need a 5-minute guide to HMS. Sorry, excuse me, very cold. HMS Splendid. Yeah, I just have to pick which one. And then so let's pick the last question. I was going to go somewhere. Where will I go? Colin Williams, was your super chat answered? I think it was. I hope it was. Yeah. I've caught up with all the super chats. So yes, I think I believe so. Right. Okay. Oh, it's really getting cold here. Move. Right, okay, so I think I will probably wrap things up there because it is now 18 minutes past midnight in the UK. So thank you everyone for coming and saying hi and asking your questions and so forth. I will hopefully not revisit. I will hopefully be doing the next live stream on the 10th. And probably start slightly earlier as well. And yeah, see you all at that point. Bye everyone.